So, the development team behind the modern-day Battlefield-style shooter called World War III has lifted the embargo on gameplay footage, and I can now produce a video giving you guys my initial impressions and thoughts as this game moves into early access on Steam. World War III is a game I've been following quite closely since its announcement due to the similarities it claimed to have with the Battlefield franchise, and I wanted to see if it could stand up against it and rub shoulders. This video should give you some indication as to how the team is doing in executing on their lofty goals. Now, it is worth remembering at this point that the team behind World War III is much smaller than the team working on Battlefield games at DICE, and therefore it would be silly to directly compare the games when it comes to overall quality and scale. But there are still some comparisons that can be made, and I think at this stage it's as good a time as any to sort of benchmark the game. After all, early access implies that more and more changes and additions will come over time. Firstly, we may as well address the server issues since the launch into early access yesterday. It's not been a great start for the dev team, and the launch was actually later than planned because of other issues they encountered as well. Right now the game has a mostly negative rating on Steam, and many of the reviews mention these server issues, and others like being stuck in an infinite black screen and heavy performance problems. This doesn't make for good reading. The footage you're seeing in the background, that was captured the day before public release. The dev team gave me a code unlocking the game slightly early, and I didn't experience these server issues then, but I did last night when I attempted to play. I know the team is working to try and smooth out these issues, but right now the feeling is just a little bit frosty with players, to say the least. Next, and starting to dig into things a little bit more, I want to talk about the gunplay here. It's really not that bad. Recoil played a big part in the engagements that I took part in, limiting certain weapons to different ranges very effectively, I might say, and the feedback that you got when landing shots on target, at least visually, was on point and easy to understand. Weapons all behave differently, and the more time you put into each of them, the more you're going to learn each gun's strengths and weaknesses. Time to kill was relatively steady and satisfying as well. There weren't times where I was sure that I should have killed somebody and they didn't die. I can't actually remember any single time that happened. Usually it was down to me not putting enough bullets into somebody, and with new games in general, I'll overcompensate when it comes to shooting and spam way more rounds downrange than necessary to make sure I'm doing all I can to stay alive. And here in World War III, it quickly became apparent what was a sufficient number of bullets was needed to kill an enemy, which was quite nice to experience. It was easy to just put my hands on the mouse and keyboard and enter into gunfights when I needed to. It's the moments leading up to and after gunfights, mainly dominated by the movement system and the time to death, which is different from time to kill, that concerned me. And it leads me into my first big observation of where World War III, I think, needs some improvement. The movement system at the moment is jerky. That's probably the best way I'd describe it. When moving around, it's hard to know if you're crouched or standing, as the animation for movement within those stances is essentially the same, it's just the speed is slightly different. This often led to rather frustrating moments where I was crouched and I tried to run, but I didn't end up running at full speed and instead just did this weird slow crouching movement, which might sound exactly like what you'd expect if you hadn't switched out of crouch, but the fact I didn't know I was still crouched to begin with, that was what made it frustrating. The animation for starting a sprint as well is quite jarring, as there's sort of this like warming up period into the sprint where your player speeds up. This is displayed as a weird field of view transition by default. It's turned on. I immediately turned it off when that started happening. It gave me the sense that I was running faster than I actually was, with closer objects whizzing past my view, but the buildings in the distance didn't appear to be getting all that much closer. This was because the field of view scaled wider as I started running, and as I said, I turned that off pretty much instantly. Also, when sprinting, some weapons completely disappear off the screen at the bottom and are held below the vision window that you're given, which is different to most first-person shooter games that I've played, and that weirded me out a little bit. It might be a feature in other more hardcore first-person shooter games that I've not played, but here, with the game appearing to mimic a lot of what Battlefield games can do, I expected the weapon model to go through some sort of swaying animation on the screen as I ran, but it didn't. This also means the pull-up animation when you do stop running and aim down sight can be extremely fast, and honestly it looks a little bit comical in my opinion. Now this might all be because the dev team hasn't fully implemented some animation sets yet, or it could be that they didn't have the tech needed or the performance room to make it work properly, but from my point of view, it just doesn't really feel that great at the moment. As for the time to death issues, well, first of all, it's an extremely short amount of time. The time of death is from the moment you take damage to actually dying, and in my opinion the whole experience is just very bad at the moment. Battlefield 5 had issues in its open beta with time to death, where it felt like you were dying extremely quickly as well, and that led to a lot of frustration and caused that the game wasn't displaying damage to the recipient properly. DICE actually figured out this was due to a netcode bug, where lots of damage was being grouped into one update to the player being shot, and you die in a much shorter amount of time than intended. It kind of feels like that's happening here in World War III, although I don't have any data to prove that, it's just based on my feelings. When shooting at someone, the time to kill is roughly the same as games like Battlefield 5 or Battlefield 4 in my opinion, but when you're on the receiving end of those bullets, it feels like you die much faster. I think the devs need to have a little bit more of a look at this. Next, I want to talk about something positive, the game mode called Warzone. It's very good in my opinion, and it expands on the Conquest game mode that Battlefield pioneered. Warzone groups 2 zones on one single objective, creating 2 locations that need to be owned by your team to score points. If either one of these zones is not held by your team, you won't score any points, and you won't be helping your team towards a victory. Now these 2 zones, they stop players camping one single location on an objective, and they make movement much more important. The zones themselves on each of the objectives aren't too far away from one another, but they're usually different enough in design to allow for differing gameplay to emerge as well. That creates even more gameplay variety. Matches do seem to last for quite a long time. I'm unsure at the present moment what the score cap for matches is in a match of Warzone, but for me personally, I'd like to see matches maybe capped at 20 minutes or so. Any longer and you risk players growing tired of the current map or situation, and considering the game is shipping with 3 maps, with more to come through early access and into the launch, player fatigue might become a bit of a problem for the dev team. That said, Warzone is a great game mode, and it kept me entertained nicely for about 2 to 3 hours the other night. I really enjoyed it. Now, I want to talk about the audio design in World War III. At the moment, it is appalling. It is really bad. It does feel as if the dev team hasn't touched the audio settings at all, and that may well be the case. It might be something they're going to work on in early access, but at the moment when you play the game, the audio engine makes it quite difficult to play sometimes. Players sound like they're firing guns right next to you, quite often in the game, but then you look around and sometimes they're 40 meters away down the street when they've got a massive machine gun in their hands, but it sounds like they're standing right next to you. This is really jarring, and it makes you feel sometimes like you've got backup in a gunfight, but actually you don't. This has a huge gameplay effect, and right now it's making gameplay worse. Huge tanks roll down the road almost completely silent until you finally hear them fire their machine gun at you, which, as I've just mentioned, sounds like they're right next to you. I had a jump around the tank dance last night with an enemy tank, and you could barely hear the thing moving around. No engine noise or anything. This thing is supposed to weigh multiple tons, and it's made of metal. Surely this thing would make sound when it moves, but in the game at the moment, they are very quiet. My sniper rifle sounds like a pea shooter, like it can barely knock a player over, let alone kill them. That degrades the gunplay experience somewhat, despite the gunplay feeling quite responsive. The audio just doesn't match up. There's no audio feedback when you get hit by a bullet, and there's no flinch of the player model either, making it feel like the damage you're taking is insignificant, but actually it's quite a deadly bullet that just landed on you. A low, dull music track plays over games almost constantly. That mixes in badly with all the other sounds and obscures some sounds as well. Enemy footsteps are basically non-existent, yet your own are probably the loudest thing in the game at the moment, and grenades and other explosions, they lack any sort of bass or punch, leaving them feeling very unfinished. Essentially, the audio system sucks right now. It's really hard to play the game without a properly refined audio system that's been mixed correctly so all the sounds are at the right volumes. It's also really hard when the directional audio system doesn't appear to work properly outside of extreme close range, or at least it doesn't feel like it to me. The distance between different objects making sounds doesn't appear to have been taken into account at the moment. The actual weapon sounds themselves are very tinny and lacking any sort of prowess whatsoever. That honestly cheapens the entire gameplay experience. The gunplay might be good, but when it sounds like I'm firing an airsoft rifle as opposed to a proper assault rifle, you either know something is wrong or it's just not finished. This is one of the biggest areas the game has to improve on if the dev team wants this game to succeed. A lot of emphasis is put on graphics in video games today, but honestly, I think audio design has much more of an impact overall, and right now, in World War III, it's just nowhere near good enough. The UI and HUD within multiplayer matches feels very early at the moment. There's lots of objects on the screen that you need to pay attention to, and there doesn't appear to be any kind of coherent design language being used, so certain elements are designed completely differently to others, and that makes the HUD very hard to read. Considering the amount of information you can get from the HUD in this game, I think it needs to go through some extensive changes and refinements to bring it up to a standard that players expect from FPS games today. I'm not saying it needs to look extremely pretty or have any flashy effects or anything like that, but it needs some serious tidying up. When it comes to menus and settings, again, you can see just how early in development this game is, and unfortunately that worsens the overall feel and look of the game. It's hard to use the sliders to set the correct settings you want for things like FOV and sensitivity, and the on-off buttons on certain lines actually overlap each other, creating this weird, horrible cluttering effect, and that makes it hard to select what you actually want to change, and this is another area that needs a serious overhaul. And considering how customizable and personal settings can make a game for different players, I'm surprised the dev team didn't focus on making this easy to use and view before pushing it out publicly. Now, I know that's a lot of criticism of World War III right there, but that is just kind of my initial impression at the moment. I jumped into a few matches last night and did have some fun, but there were some glaring issues that just stood out above the rest, and those are the things that I've spoken to you about in this video. The game is now out in the wild as part of the early access program on Steam, but I do have some tentative excitement about the game. You can see what the dev team is trying to create, and there are some really good elements to be found. I was surprised about the gunplay, I really like the game mode, and if you haven't seen the customization in this game, I'll show you on the screen right now. You can literally customize everything about your soldier and weapons and vehicles. If you want to jump in and personalize your character, this is going to be a game for you guys to do that, and I think it's going to help with the game moving forwards. If you can make your character exactly what you want it to be, I think you're going to invest a little bit more time into it and keep playing the game. The developers have pretty much gone overboard on customization, but it is really, really good to see that in a first-person shooter. At the moment, things are just sort of lacking polish where I think it matters. That might be on purpose, however. The dev team has said from the start that they want this game to be driven by the community, and changes and fixes based on feedback will be implemented into the game as part of the early access system. Rather than polishing off what is present, the team might be holding back on that and waiting to see what the game becomes with more additions and updates first. However, there are core fundamental systems that I think need addressing quickly if this game is going to retain players and succeed. The audio system needs to be worked on and brought up to an acceptable level. The movement and control systems need to be refined and tweaked to make them more fluid, and I think in general, overall, the colour palette of the game could do with a little bit less grey. The game doesn't look amazing at the moment, but it doesn't look bad either. But in darker weather, sometimes I found players can kind of hide away in dark corners very easily, and that doesn't make for great gameplay. I will be following up the development of this game closely as it enters early access, and likely I'll be covering it on my channel from time to time as things update and change. So if you're interested, make sure you subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on, that way you won't miss any videos I might post on World War III. As I said, I'm excited about the game and I can see what the developers are trying to do, but at the moment there are some key things that do need to be improved and fixed. Thank you very much for watching today, and until next time, my name is Westie, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.